All right. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today, we are going to revisit on a personality long forgotten. Nonetheless, he was too much talked about at least 60, 70 years, until 60, 70 years back in the subcontinent, Jamaluddin Afghani. The title is The Pan-Islamic Prereggrinations, that's a long journey, I guess, of Jamaluddin Afghani. And the speaker is Dr. Amir Ali, an assistant professor at Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's a political theorist, and he will be formally introduced by Dr. Supriya Ranjan, who is presently an assistant professor, Geetam University, Hyderabad, and the concluding remarks will be given by his student, Rahil Bashir, who is a PhD scholar at Center for Political Studies, JNU, and he is also perhaps a visiting faculty at Geetam University, which is a very currently established private institution in Hyderabad, focusing on technology as well as liberal arts. These two scholars are focusing on democracy and its related ups and downs. So, welcome you all. And now I invite Dr. Supriya Ranjan for the formal introduction. Ranjan sir. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Uh, Good morning to those of you who are tuning in from the US, and a very good evening to the rest of us here in India. Uh, uh, it's my privilege to introduce both my teacher and my colleague Rahil for this wonderful talk on something that I don't know nothing about, but I've been trying to read your paper, sir, Miss Sir. So it seems very fascinating, and maybe towards the end we'll have a question or two on the same. So now let me introduce the main speaker and the discussant for the event. Amir Ali. Professor Amir Ali has taught at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, since 2007. Earlier, he taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, for 3 years from 2004 to 2007. He was Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, between years 2012 to 2014. He has written two books, South Asian Islam and British Multiculturalism, uh, and Routledge 2016, and Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty and Nation State, Routledge 2022. He teaches courses in political theory, and his areas of research are multiculturalism, group rights, and British politics. He has published in journals such as Economic and Political Weekly, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and the Journal of Human Values. In addition to academic writing, he has engaged in a regular writing of political commentary that has appeared in diverse publications and platforms such as Economic and Political Weekly, Outlook, The Hindu, The Telegraph, and Al Jazeera. These political commentaries have proliferated and become more anguished as the state of world has declined and a world order comes crashing down on all sides. Apart from this, we also know Professor Ali to be a very passionate teacher in the center. That is what we know him as. Moving on to our discussion, Rahil Bashir is a PhD scholar at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research focuses on nationalism, sovereignty, and neoliberal governance in Kashmir. He is also a visiting faculty at the Department of Political Science, Geetam University, Hyderabad, and a colleague of mine. Yeah. So thank you. With this, I'll now hand it over to Professor Ali.
Thank
If
you,
you want
Supriya.
to, yeah.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thank you, Razi Saab, Faisal Saab, for asking me to present this paper on the Pan-Islamic peregrinations of Jamaluddin Afghani. This is the first time that I'm presenting this in any forum. So ये बिल्कुल ताज़ा तरीन जिसको कहते हैं ना वो है. And I mean, of course, Afghani is, for a lot of young people, may not be a very familiar figure. So my aim in this presentation will be to, of course, introduce Afghani. and also talk about, in the very end, I have a section what he would have to say about the state of the world right now. It's a bit like a thought experiment, if I can call it that, in terms of if he were alive or if he could talk to us from the grave, what he would have to say about the current state of geopolitics, which to my mind is very, very fraught. So I'm going to begin by giving a kind of a very brief introduction about who Afghani was, the circumstances of his life, very interesting circumstances of his life. He's broadly a 19th century figure. He dies in 1897, so his life does not intersect with the 20th century. But in the way that I'm going to present this paper, I will be talking about the relevance of his views. Now, the remarkable thing about Afghani is that he's extremely energetic. I mean, he's characterized by a very frenetic level of political activity. And he combines pan-Islamism with anti-colonialism. He's also an Anglophobe. He hates the British Empire. He feels that this is one of the biggest sources of the turbulence in the world. And he's always trying to find geopolitical alliances that can somehow undermine the British. Now, specifically, the theme of this paper is the alternation of Afghani's peregrinations, which are interspersed with sojourns, longish stays that he has in different locales across the world. Some very interesting. And during his stays, his sojourns, he gets into very interesting kinds of political activity. I mean, he is quite an irritant in many ways. Someone has described him, I don't know who has described him, as the Forrest Gump of the Muslim world, because he's always pops up in the most unlikely of places, and he's able to influence events in that region, and this has a kind of a knock-on effect. So, as I said, he is intriguing in many ways because he's always able to, um, kind of pop up in these circumstances that you would least expect him to. There's another way that I have of characterizing him before I start talking about him in detail. There's a story by Qudratullah and Heather called International Avaragard, where she talks about an American student in his gap year and how he travels all over the world. So Avaragard, of course, means someone who wanders around all over the world. And I think Afghani is a bit of an international Avaragard in the way that he's traveling all over the world, and the term that the peregrinations that I've used. So he was born in 1838 in Asadabad, which is northwestern Iran. So his name is Afghani, and he adopted that name to give the impression that he was Afghanistan. For right from the very manner in which he takes an adoptive name, gives you a sense of the series of dissimulations that characterize his life. So what he's really trying to do is he's always concealing himself. He's always trying to be what he isn't. And there are reasons for this, and he is a bit of a difficult character to unpack, and in fact, that's what makes him so intriguing. So, as I've noted, that this particular adoptive name of his, he's actually from Iran, but he names himself as Afghani, is one of the first of a series of dissimulations that he adopts, which is to craft a particular kind of political, intellectual career path. He's also a Shia, but he's another identity that he disowns. He always kind of passes himself as a Sunni. He downplays the Shia identity because he believes that the Sunni Shia schism in the Muslim world is extremely problematic. He's a figure who, in the 19th century, wants to draw from the solidarity of the Muslim world. So his pan-Islamism is actually to do with this attempt to bring about a certain solidarity in the face of the marauding, rampaging imperialisms like the French, the British, the Russian to some extent. A lot of people have commented on Afghani's religious faith, or rather the lack of religious faith. So a significant scholar, Eli Kadori from the School of Oriental and African Studies, back in 1963 or 64, wrote a book on him where he talks about the kind of lack of faith in Afghani, and also his student Muhammad Abdu for that matter. And the point that Kedori seems to be making is that, well, both Afghani and his student Muhammad Abdu, very famous student, who went on to become the rector of the Al-Azhar in Cairo, the famous Al-Azhar, they are instrumentally using their religious identity, that they are in some ways using this identity merely as an instrumentality in a very utilitarian sort of way, almost crafty, in a very crafty way at certain moments, to build up this particular political enterprise that they have of Pan-Islamism. So Kedori, the scholar who wrote a 100-page book back in 1963, refers to Afghani as someone who is, his journalism. Afghani was also a journalist. He refers to his journalism as mediocre, and he refers to Abdu's theology as superficial. Now, that's a pretty disdainful way of looking at it. I intend to look at him in a slightly more positive manner. But let me come to the reason why I have used the title Peregrinations in the word peregrinations in my title. It has to do with a story. He engages in an early round of travel. So when he's like 16, 17, perhaps, he actually comes to India. And he is in India during the time of the 1857 mutiny. And I think that is one of the reasons why he becomes he has such a hatred of the British, because he can see the way the British are crushing that particular revolt. So after this early sojourn, when he's in India at the age of 17, 18, he goes to Afghanistan. And after Afghanistan, he goes back to his native Asadabad, where he visits his family. And by that time, he would have been a 20, 21-year-old man, young man. And his father, like all fathers, convincing their sons at that age, he tells Jamaluddin Afghani that it's now time for him to cease his travels, to settle down, to get married, start a family. Now, he says something very interesting. He says that he objects to this suggestion of his father. He says that the considerable expanse of the world is not capacious enough to contain the wingspan of his desired flight. Now, the first time that I heard this story about Afghani was told to me by someone in Urdu, and I hope that most people will know Urdu, but I'll just say this in Urdu first, and then I'll translate this. The way that it was told to me by someone in, as I said, very high flown Urdu, was that Afghani said to his father कि दुनिया की वसत बहुत बहुत ज्यादा है, लेकिन इतनी ज्यादा नहीं कि जब अपने पर फैला लूं तो उसको समा ले अपने अंदर. Now, that's a very, very interesting idea. So, the translation that I have in English is that Afghani tells his father, I am like a royal falcon, a royal peregrine falcon, for whom the wide arena of the world, for all its breadth, is too narrow for flight. So, he is a bit of a free bird, as you can see from this particular quotation, the way that he tells his father that he will not do as he says. So, it is from this particular idea of the royal peregrine falcon, a remarkable bird which is able to achieve very high speeds when it soars in the sky, that I get the term peregrinations. And these peregrinations take Afghani all over the world. So, as I said, India is one of the early stages of his peregrinations. He goes to Afghanistan, he gets into trouble there. He goes to Iran, again, he gets into trouble. From there, he goes to Istanbul, where he's again caught in trouble. From there, he goes to Cairo. He spends perhaps the largest or the longest of his sojourns is actually in Cairo from 1871 to 1879. So, just to remind people, he was born in 1838. He comes to India around 1857. So, he would have been a teenager, perhaps a man approaching his 20s. And the interesting thing that drew me to Afghani was this fact that wherever he's going, he's actually getting into a lot of trouble because of his political intrigues. So he seems not to be able to keep himself away from trouble. So of course, Cairo is a very significant part of his journey and his peregrinations and sojourns that I suggest that alternate and give us the kind of interesting career that he has. After Cairo, he actually comes back to India and he spends a good 2 years in India. He arrives in Karachi. From Karachi, he goes to Hyderabad. From Hyderabad to Bhopal. From Bhopal to Calcutta. Finally, he goes to Madras. From the port of Madras, he goes to England, spends a few years in England, meets Randolph Churchill, convinces Churchill that the Mehdi, who is leading an uprising in Sudan, is his student. Now, that's not true. The Mehdi was not his student, and he's just bragging that he was actually his student, and he can actually intercede on the behalf of the British and get the Mehdi to do what the British want them to do. Now, I hope that gives you a sense of how much of a mischief maker he could be. Now, this is not to dismiss him completely. The interventions that he makes are very, very significant, and I would want to come to some of those significant interventions. In 1868, when he's in Afghanistan, he is imprisoned, and he becomes a little morose, very melancholy there, because during his imprisonment, he makes a statement that he's much misunderstood. It's a bit reminds me of that share, which goes something like this: नागुफ्ता रही मेरे दिल में दास्ता मेरी न कोई समझा इस दयार में ज़बा मेरी. So he's this melancholy figure as he's imprisoned in the Bala Hasar in Kabul, and he's saying that let me read this out. So he writes a painful, melancholic account in rhymed prose of his predicament. Here he bewails how he has been much misunderstood all around, with the English thinking that he's Russian, the Muslim thinking he's a Zoroastrian, the Sunnis thinking that he is a Shia, with the Shia in turn thinking that he's an enemy of Ali. After continuing the same vein about how theists have imagined him as a materialist and the pious find no faith or piety in him, he concludes on this very sad and almost ominous note. Now, we'll read this quote very carefully because it will form a very important part of this paper. It will recur at the end. So he says about himself that seated in the Bala Hasar in Kabul, this is the fort that he's imprisoned in, my hands tied and my legs broken, I wait to see what the curtain of the unknown will deign to reveal to me and what fate this malevolent firmament has in store for me. Now, that's a pretty interesting term to use, curtain of fate, because obviously he does not know what fate has in store for him. And as you can see, he's in a very melancholic mood when he says this. So that's terms of giving an introduction of the man himself, what he was capable of, what he was all about. I'm going to suggest in the next section that I now want to talk about that there is a strange combination of the Machiavellian and the mystical in Afghani. Now, many people know that Machiavelli is this famous 15th century, 16th century political theorist. He writes a book called The Prince, which is in the genre of the advice to princes. And Machiavelli in politics is known for kind of amorality, a kind of Machiavellian machination. Now, Afghani is capable of that. He's entirely capable of Machiavellian machinations. But I also want to suggest that he's also capable of certain mystical flights. Now, again, recalling the point about the peregrine falcon that I made, I would want to draw attention to people about how significant the flight of a bird is in a lot of Islamic intellectualism. So I would like to bring in a very famous 12th century text by a very famous Persian poet, Fariduddin Attar, who writes an allegorical poem. It's called Mantiq al-Tair, which means the conference of the birds. Now, this is very interesting because, as I said a little while ago, the idea of the flight of a bird gives rise to a certain kind of a mystical, imaginative flight of fantasy. And my point about Afghani is that despite his Machiavellian machinations, as I call them, at the same time, he is capable of some of these very remarkable mystical flights of imagination. And there are 2 points that I want to make about this specific aspect of Islamic intellectualism, this idea of the flight of a bird, which I have tried to capture firstly in the quote that he tells, the quote that I read out when he tells his father, "Don't chain me down, don't get me, don't marry me off. I am a peregrine falcon, and the expanse of the world is just not wide enough when I spread my wings." So that's one aspect of the flight of a bird that I want to bring in. The second aspect of a flight of a bird is actually contained in one of my favorite lines in Iqbal, where he exhorts the Shaheen, the famous bird that is a leitmotif of Iqbal's Shairi, when he says, and again I'm going to say this in Urdu and translate this. So Iqbal exhorts in his poetry an imaginative flight beyond immediate frontiers when he says, "Tu Shahi hai, parwaaz hai kaam tera, tere samne asma aur bhi hain." And I'm going to translate this in English. This is my own translation, by the way. I hope it's not too bad. "Thou art the Shaheen destined to take flight. Behold the vastness of vistas that still await thee." So, as I said, that's the second aspect of this mystical flight of a bird, to my mind, characterizes Afghani's political trajectory, his journey, his peregrinations that are interspersed with his sojourns that I will talk a little more about as this paper progresses. But let me come back to Attar because, and let me just hold up the book. I'm not a good PowerPoint presenter. So in the good old-fashioned way, I'm just going to hold up the book that I'm talking about. This is the English translation, the Penguin edition of Fariduddin Attar's The Conference of the Birds. I hope you can see it. I hope I can hold it long enough for people to be able to see it. Mantiq al-Tair is of course, the Persian title. It was written in the 12th century. Now, in this poem, Attar talks about the hoopoe, a very famous bird, a bird mentioned in the Quran, who exhorts a group of birds to undertake a journey across 7 valleys so that they can then discover the mystical simurgh, a mythical bird of Persian poetry, of Persian history. So he tells the birds that if we are able to undertake this journey, then we will be able to come across or be able to come face to face with the Sumur, who is our sovereign, and this would be a life-changing experience. Now, the birds start dithering. So, for example, the finch is cowardly. The finch says, "No, I can't do the journey. It's just too much for me." The nightingale says, "No, I am the lover bird. I have to pay obeisance to the rose in the garden." Famous idea of the nightingale and the rose. So the different birds all offer different excuses, and all these birds represent different human character flaws and character traits. Now, the hoopoe is able to convince all the birds to undertake this very arduous journey. So they undertake it. They're able to cross the 7 valleys, and once they cross the 7 valleys, they actually come into they come face to face with the Samuruk. Now, the remarkable thing that they realize, there are 30 of them who survive the journey. And the remarkable thing they realize is that the Simurgh is actually a reflection of themselves, which goes to show that the divine is somehow within us. That there are 30 birds, and there's a pun in Persian. I don't know Persian, but there's a pun in terms of 30, because there are 30 birds, and the Simurgh actually contains the number 30 within it. So the mantiq there is this allegory which conveys the idea that even a little cowardly, small, frail bird like the finch, if it is able to make this particular journey, will be able to confront the Simurgh, which is nothing more than a reflection of its own transformation through this strange migratory experience. So what this particular poetic allegory tells us is the significance of flight, of peregrination, of travel, of migration, of hijrat, and of course, interspersed with the sojourns. Somewhere, I think Afghani takes heart from this particular idea. So I'm going to read out one particular line from Attar's. This is a quote that I've got from a very famous work by the German scholar Annemarie Schimmel. It's called the just give me a minute as I look at my notes. Yeah, The Mystical Dimensions of Islam, where she talks about Attar's Mantiq al-Tayr, or the Conference of Birds. So the line goes like this, and I think this is something that Afghani would have imbibed. Attar's line is, "Out of the ocean like rain clouds come and travel, for without traveling you will never become a pearl." Now this gives to us a significance, the significance of travel, certainly for Afghani, and which perhaps gives us a sense of why traveling and the kind of peregrination that I've suggested is so important for his life becomes the basis of his political career. Now, just a quick note on the Simurgh, because the idea behind the Simurgh was that perhaps this was the bird where actually the twain between the West and the East met. Famous line of Rudyard Kipling: "The East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." The idea behind the Simurgh was, this mythical bird that I've been talking about, is that when it spreads its wings, the expanse of its wingspan is such that it is able to unite the Maghrib, which is the West, and the Mashriq, which is the East. Now, somewhere, perhaps this is playing in Afghani's mind when he says this, because Afghani, of course, is from the northwestern Hamdan region of Iran. Attar was from the famous Nishapur, which is eastern Persia. Now, the opening remarks that I have made are in terms of what I suggest are a very strange, almost awkward combination of the Machiavellian machinations along with this mystical flight that I talked about. So I hope I've been able to make that particular point clear. I'll also keep track of the time because I think I have 45 minutes. I next want to come to the idea of the particular Islamic idiom that Afghani adopts for his politics. Now, I'm suggesting that there's a very idiosyncratic element in this idiom. Now, before I start talking about the elements of that idiosyncratic idiom, as I call it, let me suggest that there is a particular range or a particular geographical expanse over which these peregrinations are happening. So I've already talked about the early ones. For example, he's born in Iran, he goes to India, he comes to Afghanistan. I've also given a sense of let's say, his travels through Iran into Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire, and Cairo, which is, as I said a little while ago, is his longest sojourn. Now, there are three significant European capitals which he visits. Most probably Paris, to some extent Moscow, and also London, which is perhaps one of the briefest of his sojourns. But before I talk about his activities in these different centers, I do want to bring up the particular expanse, and I'm going to draw from the Chicago historian Marshall Hodgson, famous work of his, The Adventure of Islam. Again, I'm going to hold up the book so that people can see it. This is the third volume of Marshall Hodgson's The Adventure of Islam, a very famous work. This is the volume on the gunpowder empires. I hope people can see that. Let me hold it long enough for people to be able to see it. And if that is the case, I'll just put it down now. The gunpowder empires, according to Hodgson, are the three geographically contiguous empires. The first is, of course, the part of the world that I'm sitting in right now, the famous city of Delhi. जिसके बारे में किसी ने कहा था, दिल्ली वो शहर जो था आलम इंतखाब, हम रहने वाले उसी उजड़े दयार के हैं, बाकी उजड़ा दयार आजकल. People in Delhi will know what I mean. But the Mughal Empire, this is a very significant gunpowder empire according to Afghani. Not Afghani, but according to Marshall Hodgson, the Chicago historian. Next to the Mughal Empire is the famous Safavid Empire, current day Iran. And of course, moving further west, one has the very significant expanse, both temporal and spatial, of the Ottoman Empire, which very significantly extends into the European regions, the Balkans. So my point is that when I talk about the peregrinations of Jamaluddin Afghani, these peregrinations range over this particular expanse, the expanse of the three gunpowder empires that Hodgson has talked about. Let me repeat those gunpowder empires. They are the Mughal, part of the world that I am in right now, and of course the center of that empire, Delhi itself. Secondly, the Safavid Empire, contemporary, which would cover the expanse of contemporary Iran, and then the Ottoman Empire. Now, having talked about that, let me give people a sense of what exactly Afghani is getting into. Um, as I said, he's a mischief maker, and one of the ways in which he goes to these different locales is that he ingratiates himself with the powers that be. So in 1870, in one of the early rounds of his peregrinations, so around in 1870, he would still have been in his 30s if I can get my maths right. I was horrible at maths. But in 1870, he's able to make a trip to Istanbul. He is able to befriend a very significant Ottoman noble called Riaz Pasha, and he's able to convince people that he's sufficiently important. I mean, he has a reputation. His reputation seems to precede him. I mean, this is in the days before social media. He would have no Facebook to talk about himself, but he has a significant following. As a result of which, in the year 1870, when he is in Istanbul, he is asked to give a series of lectures at the inauguration of a particular university. Now, in this inauguration, he says something pretty controversial. What he ends up saying is that he compares prophethood to philosophers. And he says that, well, both prophets and philosophers are remarkable individuals who can see beyond the curve. There is a certain manner in which their vision is extended beyond the immediate horizon that most people can see. However, he makes this argument, well, sometimes philosophers have a certain greater ability than prophets. Now, of course, this is for any center of Islamic orthodoxy would become a controversial statement to make. So the rest of his lecture series is cancelled, and he has to basically scoot and leave Istanbul in 1870. So where does he end up? He ends up in Cairo, 1871. As I said, I think I've made this point twice, that there's almost a kind of a decade-long sojourn in Cairo, and this is perhaps where a lot of very interesting things happen to Afghani. This is where he meets his most famous student, Muhammad Abdu, and also certain other students. For example, Saad Zaghlul Pasha, who becomes very important in Egypt later on. But what I want to kind of suggest in terms of this early phase, this phase in the early 1870s, is that Afghani is clever and crafty enough not to directly engage in politics. Okay, so he knows his limitations. He knows that there are certain moments when he has to wait his turn. So what is he doing around this time? See, he does get a stipend from Riaz Pasha, who's met earlier. And the stipend is, I don't know if it would be substantial, but it's substantial enough for him to be able to frequent the famous cafes of Cairo. Now, apparently, he also gets a teaching position in Al Azhar. Now, how true this is, we don't know. This is slightly contested. But the interesting thing about his teaching activities is that he doesn't teach during the daytime. He actually teaches all night in the various cafes of Cairo, and they're very famous. And there is one particular cafe that he frequents, which is the Matatia Cafe. I told some of my JNU students, I'm sure there will be JNU students in this audience. So one of my students suggested that's something I should be doing as well. Sit at Ganga Dhaba all night and declaim. Ganga Dhaba is our most famous place where students gather and have cups of endless tea and other snacks. And it's open until the late hours of the morning. I don't know. In my student days, it was. I haven't checked recently. This campus has changed. But this was a suggestion that one of my students gave me. Perhaps you should try that at Ganga Dhaba. I said, let me give it a try, perhaps after this presentation is over. So as you can see, this is the kind of interesting thing that he's doing. However, towards the end of the 1870s, certain kind of rebellion is stirring in Egypt. This gives rise to, between 1879 to 1882, the Urabi rebellion. This is led by a general in the Egyptian army, Colonel Urabi, and he's very upset about the manner in which he has been denied promotion. He feels that it's the Circassian elements in the army that they get their promotions, and he hasn't been able to get his promotions. So he's able to kind of arouse the discontent, especially of the Fellahin, the peasantry in the Nile Delta. And because of this accelerating political activity, Afghani, it seems, can't resist himself. He's a very strange kind of a character. He's easily tempted by the political. So he makes this remarkable statement to the Fellahin where he says, "Oh, you Fellahin, these are the peasants of the Nile Delta. You break your souls and you break your hearts when you tear the earth apart to feed your oppressors. Why don't you break the hearts of your oppressors?" Now, that's a pretty provocative statement to make, actually. And that gets him noticed by the political authorities. There's also a story of him addressing a 4,000 large gathering at a very famous mosque in Cairo. Exactly which mosque it is, I forget. But in terms of this set of incitement to political activity, he is increasingly getting noticed by intelligence agencies, especially the British intelligence agency. Now, the interesting thing about Afghani here is that exactly as the Urabi rebellion is stirring, in 1879, he gets signals that he'd better scoot again. So he scooted already from Istanbul to Cairo, and he gets signals that he'd better leave now. So he leaves just as the rebellion is stirring, and he's done his little bit of mischief to kind of add to that particular insurrection and stirring. So where does he go? From Port Said, he takes a boat and he makes that journey to India that I was talking about a little while ago. So between the years 1880 and 1882, almost 2 years, a little less than 2 years. I think it's 20 months or so, 20, 21 months. He is in India. And as I said, he lands in the port of Karachi. He goes to Bombay as well. In those days, it would still have been Bombay. Of course, now is Mumbai. The series of renamings that we have in this country, for whatever reason, I've never been able to understand. And he's most warmly welcomed in the court of the Nizam in Hyderabad. And I remember Hyderabad would have been a very significant global Muslim presence in those days, rivaling perhaps the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul itself, for that matter. Now, he is able to very significantly impress the famous prime minister of the Nizam, the famous museum in Hyderabad. Hyderabad people can remind me. I've forgotten Salarjung. Salarjung, the prime minister. There's a famous Salarjung museum in Hyderabad, which is I always visit every time I go there. And he is again received as this very wise sage, this wise Muslim learned scholar. And he tells everyone he's from Afghanistan, but we already know that he's not from Afghanistan. Now, again, in India, he's not engaging in any political activity. Remember, the years 1880 to 1882 would be a few years before the formation of the Indian National Congress, which is 1885. But he does have a good sense of the depredations of British rule. So he does make this comment. I mean, he's sharp and incisive enough to understand that the railways that the British are introducing are actually not for Indians or the good of the Indians. This is actually meant to open the hinterland of India to the larger free markets of the world. And he has a sense that this will be exploitative. So as you can see, he is a remarkably intelligent man in that sense. And he has a good sense of the way that that politics will go. Now, I hope by these three series of sojourns that I've talked about, the early sojourn in India, in Afghanistan, where he's imprisoned, in Istanbul, where he gets into trouble because of that 1870 speech that he gives at a university in Istanbul, and of course the decade that he spends in Cairo, and then he comes to India. Now, again, in India, he's not getting into any political activity. What he is doing is that he's writing very feverishly. He writes especially against Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who he doesn't seem to like at all. It's very strange because Sir Syed is a modernist, Afghani is a modernist, but the reason why he does not like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is because he feels that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is too pro-British. He's too anglicized, he's too westernized. And as I've already pointed out, he just hates the British. He absolutely hates the British. He's no Anglophile, certainly an Anglophobe. So he does write a very significant piece during his time in India. I think he writes this in Hyderabad, and he gives lectures in Calcutta, where he talks about the refutation of the materialists, and he's saying very, very nasty things about Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the famous founder of Aligarh Muslim University, not very far away from Delhi. Let me make one more point about Afghani's creativity. And again, this is a point that I'm going to make with reference to Hodgson's work that I just talked about, The Venture of Islam, the third volume, The Gunpowder Empires. And I'm going to make this point by bringing in a more recent scholar that some of you may be familiar with. I can see some very academic people in the audience, and people who followed some of these debates. So a recent book that came out by the late Harvard scholar Shahab Ahmed, who tragically died. This book was published posthumously. It was published after Shahab Ahmed's death. Very promising scholar, and his book called "What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic." Now, Shahab Ahmed in this book draws from Hodgson, and what he draws from Hodgson are three distinctions that Hodgson makes in The Venture of Islam. These three distinctions are between the terms Islamdom, and Islamicate. Now, I'm using these terms to suggest that there is a certain kind of a creativity that one can see in Afghani's sojourns and the in sojourns that intersperse his peregrinations. The two terms that I'm using, And this creativity actually comes from the idea of the Islamic hate. Now, let me try to define what the Islamic hate means. It is something which is a set of or a complex of artistic, literary, scientific, and cultural activities broadly inspired by, but not narrowly confined and defined by Islam. So it's not what the Orthodox would consider to be narrowly Sharia defined Islam. So there's a certain kind of a capaciousness of the imagination. The Orthodox would say that he's taking liberties, and he does take liberties. He's no Orthodox Muslim. He's not even a practicing Muslim, and his practice of Islam seems to be something of a dissimulation. But we can perhaps bring that issue up in Q&A if people feel that that needs to be brought up. So this is the kind of the kind of where his creativity is flowing from. It's flowing from this particular term that Hodgson and Shahab Ahmed are. Shahab Ahmed is getting it from Hodgson, are privileging in terms of the Islamic, which, let me just define this term once again. It is a set of or a complex of artistic, literary, scientific, and cultural activities broadly inspired by, but not narrowly confined and defined by Islam. Now, let me add one more thing. Let me try to bring in the artistic element in Afghani. The canvas upon which these peregrinations are happening is the canvas of the gunpowder empires. Remember that point that I made? But Shah Ahmed uses another term in his book, which is what he refers to as the Balkans to Bengal complex. Now, gives you a sense of the expansive presence of Islam, especially at the height of its powers. When the Ottoman Empire was challenging European powers, and Europeans were very scared of the Ottoman Empire. But the Balkans to Bengal complex that Shah Ahmed is using gives us a sense of this larger geographical sweep, this expanse. And my point, which I will now develop in this part of the paper, is that this particular geographical imagination necessarily, inevitably, will transcend the narrow confines of the nation state. And this is a point that I hope to develop subsequently in a later part of this paper, as I now enter the second half of this paper. I hope I'm doing okay for time, because that's always my big concern.
Don't worry about it. Keep on going.
Okay, that's brilliant. I mean, if I don't worry about time, I can just keep going then. Right. Let me add one more thing to this, which again is Shahab Ahmed's term. Book is a book that has given rise to a great deal of debate. And I must say that I was personally disagreeing with large parts of it. I did find it a very interesting book to read for the simple reason that Shahab Ahmed writes remarkable academic prose. Generally, academics like me, we write very badly. It's just in the nature of the damn thing, academia. It does not have any kind of literary flair to it. And I must say that the quantity and quality of the Urdu poems that Shah Ahmed brings up in his work makes it a delight to read. It's a book, big fat 400-page book to read, but the manner in which Ahmed is able to sprinkle and garnish these different very nice Urdu couplets and poems made it a delight. But that was my kind of a sneaking reference to academic writing, which I generally don't admire too much. It's a very forced, contrived manner of writing, which I must say I don't enjoy writing. My PhD is a memory that is a bit of a trauma, but that was 20 years ago. It's a long time. To come back, the point I'm trying to bring up here in terms of Shah Ahmed's point. One answer that Shah Ahmed gives in terms of what is Islam, he says, yes, that it's a form of hermeneutical meaning making. So what Afghani is doing, if I can use this particular interpretation, is through these series of peregrinations and the sojourns that intersperse them and the kind of writing activity that he's doing, he is, he's trying to make meaning of what exactly Islam is. And I bring that element of what I call the mystical back here. So, in the early part of the paper, I suggested, well, Afghani is a strange combination of the Machiavellian machinations and the mystical. Now, again, when it comes to the element of the creativity part of it, this Islamicate aspect, this complex of scientific cultural activities, what I feel is, characterizes this is this particular manner in which he's not only giving meaning to his own life, but by giving meaning to his own life through his particular political career, he's also trying to make sense of what exactly Islam is in the 19th century. So let me come to what exactly is the predicament of Islam around this time. The three gunpowder empires that I've talked about are challenged by the technicalistic development of Europe. Again, technicalistic development is a term that Marshall Hodgson uses in his book. Now, what does that mean? It means that the European empires, especially the French and the British, not so much the Russians. Russians are a bit of a latecomer, slightly more backward when it comes to more the greater advancement that is experienced by Western Europe. The kind of technicalistic, scientific development of Europe that abuts these empires is pressing down upon them. And it is this aspect of abutting and pressing down upon them that acts as a source of constraint. And Afghani feels that there must be a response to this. Now, there is a response. There is a response from the generation of what is called 1798. That's the time when Napoleon comes to Cairo. And there are remarkable things that Napoleon has to say about Islam when he's in Cairo, but let me set that aside for now. But the point here is that there are two kinds of responses that I want to focus on. Firstly, there's a very kind of elitist westernizing response. The idea that we must become exactly like the Europeans, and when we become like the Europeans, the Muslims will be able to achieve the kind of remarkable advances that Europe is displaying to the world and is dazzling the rest of the world, certainly these parts of the world. Now, Afghani doesn't like this particular sorry, there's a message. Okay, anyway. Right. The second aspect, which I am trying to suggest, is the idea that Afghani doesn't like this particular westernization that many elites, for example, the elites of Cairo, the elites of Istanbul, where he spent time, or for that matter, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who he opposes so much, he then comes up with a response to this in terms of what I'm calling the idiosyncratic element of his the Islamic idiosyncratic element. So what he's saying is he's almost suggesting that there is a certain copying, an imitation of the West, and that is that the elites of these societies are taking recourse to this. And rather than taking recourse to this, there is this very significant element of the Islamic, which, as I said, is not orthodox, but it's like Islamicate that he's bringing in. And by bringing in this Islamicate element, there is a certain kind of infusing of an Islamic idiom that is being brought in here. Now, let me make a slightly more political science point to this, in terms of my own political science training. What I'm now going to suggest is that in terms of the different locales that he's part of, he is encouraging a set of nationalistic responses. So when he's in Egypt, for example, the Urabi rebellion is an example of a nationalistic response. Similarly, when he's in India, he is stressing the kind of composite nationalism that the Congress was putting forward. The idea of Hindu-Muslim unity is something that he also is talking about and espousing. When it comes to Iran, there's also a kind of a nationalistic response that especially he encourages around the year 1890, where again he has to leave because of the kind of mischief making that he's often getting into. But my point is that in the different locales, there is a certain kind of I'm just a little being distracted by these messages. So if you could refrain from that, and the messages come up later in the Q&A, because they pop up on the screen, and inevitably I get to read them, and it's kind of okay. There's a Khudafiz.
Okay. I will stop the chat. Okay.
Yeah. The Khudafiz was yeah.
And you will stop at 12:05. You have plenty of time.
How much time do I have?
Your math, as you said, was 16 more minutes or 16.
Okay, I wind up. It's just that the messages were completely kind of disrupting my train of thought. Okay, yeah, right. So let me get back. Now, what I'm trying to say is that in these different locales, wherever his sojourns are taking place, he is encouraging a kind of nationalism. But my point is that these nationalisms are nested nationalisms. Okay. Now, these nested nationalisms are under the larger rubric of the Pan-Islamism that he is developing, and therefore the title of my paper, The Pan-Islamic Peregrinations of Jamaluddin Afghani. So let me make this point once again, and then I'll move on. My point is that in these different locales, there are a set of nationalism that he's encouraging. Okay, nationalism is the traditional, the usual political response to colonialism. But there is a very significant aspect of this nationalism. So there is the kind of nationalism that is encouraged in Egypt through the Urabi rebellion, 1879 to 1882. In Iran, there is a rebellion against the tobacco concession that the government gives to the British, and that creates a great deal of discontent in Iran. Also in India, there's a certain kind of nationalism that is being encouraged at a very nascent level. But my point is that these are what I call nested nationalisms. These nationalisms are nested within the larger rubric of the Pan-Islamism that by the late 70s and 80s, Afghani is developing in a very systematic way. Now, let me make a point that I have perhaps not made, which is that when it comes to his Pan-Islamism, this is Pan-Islamism that is developing at a very late stage of his career. It is by 1880, when he has moved to Paris and he's been reunited with his old faithful student and disciple, Muhammad Abdu, that he starts a journal in Arabic called Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa. And this is where the idea of Pan-Islamism becomes firmed up. So it's not as if the Pan-Islamic element was there from the very beginning. As a result of these series of peregrinations and sojourns, and many of them, the Pan-Islamism develops by 1883, 1884. I forget the exact number of issues of Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa that came out, but the term means the firmest bond. And what he's trying to suggest is that the firmest bond is the Ottoman Empire. Now, by this time, Sultan Abdul Hamid II has ascended to being Sultan. And what one finds in Afghani is a very conscious cultivation of Sultan Abdul Hamid. He writes in 1878 a letter where he very openly says that I am willing to be your advisor. And from 1878 to 1883, one can see, as I said, this particular aspect of Afghani's unilateral preferring of advice and help to Sultan Abdul Hamid. Okay, since I have realized that I am running out of time, what I'm going to do is focus very quickly on this latter part of his life. The point that I just made about the 1878 letter that he wrote, this is just before he comes to India. After leaving India, he goes to London, and then he spends perhaps 3 years, or perhaps a little less than 3 years in Paris. And as I said, Paris becomes important for Afghani because around this time, he is bringing out this journal called Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, the firmest bond, where the ideas of Pan-Islamism becomes very significant. I'm going to make 2 further points and then bring this discussion to an end, and hopefully try to respond to as many questions in Q&A as I can. The term Pan-Islamism in some ways resembles the other pan movements of the 19th century. So, for example, Pan-Germanism or Pan-Slavism. But there's one distinction that I would like to make, and that is that usually the European pan movements, the Pan-Germanism or Pan-Slavism, tended to have a very distinctly anti-Semitic element in them. This is not the case in Afghani. Amongst his he has a whole set of very admiring students. There are some students who actually love him, and this is what any teacher would always want, right? These admiring students all around him. One of his very faithful disciples was the Jewish playwright James Sanua, who he's very close to him. One last point: there's a certain kind of a bitterness that starts setting into Afghani towards the end of his life. He dies in 1897. He contracts cancer of the jaw because of his chain smoking habits. And the end is a little sad, but the melancholy that sets in. Remember when I talked about his 1868 the complaint that he makes, that he's sitting in the Bala Hasar in Kabul, and he feels that he doesn't know what the curtain of fate will hold for him. Melancholy seems to come back, and it's on that melancholic note. I'm sorry to end on a melancholic note, but it's a note of melancholy, that note of being morose, where he says that perhaps it was all a waste, that he had always concentrated on the elite, and that perhaps this particular concentration on the elite was perhaps something he should not have done, and this was a bit of a failure. So I'm going to quote from Nikki Keddy's biography, where he says, where he is quoted as saying that the elites, his appeal to the elites, these rulers in Istanbul and Iran, in Tehran and Cairo, that he was making was perhaps in vain, and that he may as well have invested his boundless energies in the receptive ground of people's thoughts. One quick point about 1890, the tobacco rebellion that was given, the concession that was given in Iran. Again, he's inciting the ulama, especially the Shia ulama. There's a fatwa that comes out, and again he has to escape from that part of the world, and he escapes. He's actually thrown out. He has taken a kind of bust or refuge in a shrine outside Tehran, and he feels that because it's a bust, because it's an inviolable kind of a refuge, the political authorities will not dare to enter and physically seize him. But that's exactly what happens. He's seized. He's taken to the bordering province of Kermanshah, Thankfully, the governor of Kermanshah treats him well, but then he is sent into Ottoman territories. He spends some time in Baghdad, then he goes to Basra, but he feels very aggrieved at the particular manner in which he's been treated. He says that, he's a descendant of the Prophet, he's a Sayyid, he's a learned man, and this was no way to treat him. He's by now an old man. He has bouts of illness, so he's very upset about that particular manner in which he is thrown out of the country of his own birth, Iran. Of course, he would not ever claim that he was from Iran. But let me come to my last section. I should really wind up now. And this is the section of what would Jamaluddin Afghani have to say. Now, this actually is the prompt for this paper. This paper, as I was telling Razi Sahib a little while ago, and also other students that I've been talking to about this paper, arose from very contemporary events that have been happening in the world. The kind of complete change of the world order that we are witnessing right now. In terms of, it's difficult to say what tomorrow holds. It's become that uncertain. So the aim of this paper then is to raise the cryptic question of what Jamaluddin Afghani would have to say about developments in the world, especially in the Middle East. Because remember, he died in 1897. Now, 2 decades after his death, in 1917, the Balfour Declaration would have been issued by the British, that commitment on the part of the British to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1916, you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that secret agreement between an Englishman and a Frenchman, Francois Picot and Mark Sykes, where basically they're agreeing to carve up the lands of the Ottoman Empire because the First World War is slowly drawing to a close. Now, the point I'm trying to bring up here is the very same Ottoman Empire that Afghani thought would be the firmest bond, the center of the Muslim world. If that center it collapses, everything falls apart. It is precisely that Ottoman Empire that has been carved up by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And of course, I talked about the Balfour Declaration of 1970 that happens 2 decades after his death. But I want to end on this note, which is the point about nationalism that I made a little while ago. Now, I said that there is a certain kind of a nested nationalism that Afghani is encouraging. That nested nationalism is settling within the larger rubric of Pan-Islamism. Now, I want to suggest that the Arab nationalism across the Arab world is a strange kind of a nationalism where it's a nationalism the French word sans, without nation state. Now, I'm making this point because let's take Egyptian nationalism, for example, under the auspices of a strong Arab nationalist leader like Jamal Abdel Nasser. Now, between the years 58 and 61, because of Nasser's efforts, we had the merger of Egypt and Syria for the sake of a larger pan-Arabism. Now, my point is that this is a very strange kind of nationalism. And nationalism saw the nation state. Now, I'm making this point because usually in politics, in international relations, in all these social science disciplines, which deal with the idea of nationalism is a diffuse idea. And the diffuseness of that idea is instantiated, it is concretized, it is contained in this container that we call the nation state. Now, the point that I'm making is that because of the long shadow that Afghani is casting over the Middle East, even though he's long dead, but this idea of what I call a nationalism saw the nation state is, to my mind, very intriguing. And the final point of the paper that I want to make, there is one quick point that I will quickly make and then open it up to Q&A, which is that the thing about nationalism in that world that I'm trying to focus on is that there are 3 different kinds of nationalism that are coming from different cardinal directions. So from the east, you have Egyptian nationalism. And then from the north, you have Ottoman Turkish nationalism under the auspices of the Committee for Union and Progress, for example, the Young Turks, figures like Zia Gökalp. So I made the point about from the east, the Egyptian nationalism. From the north, you have a Turkish Ottoman nationalism. And from the east, you have Persian nationalism, which draws from the deep civilizational foundations of Persia, its Zoroastrian roots, and of course, it's the very predominant Shia element that one finds. Now, as a result of this, these 3 nationalisms that are converging at the center, and of course, the center of the Arab world is, of course, the Jaziratul Arab, as it's called, the Arabian Peninsula, Mecca and Medina, and Jerusalem, for that matter. But what I want to end on is this particular point that by 1917 and 1948, the major challenge for a lot of Muslim and intellectual thought becomes the Zionist nation state of Israel. And we can see the trouble and the nuisance and the larger roguish state nature of this, that this is creating. So I'm going to end with an apology for ending on a very, very melancholic note, which is that recently I was reading Pankaj Mishra's book, The World After Gaza. And he suggests that there are, and I'm suggesting that Afghani would have been very melancholy to look at the world as it is right now. If we were to be able to talk to him beyond the grave, we would have a very, very melancholic conversation. But the reason why I said Mishra's book, The World After Gaza, is that many of us are unsuccessfully trying to grapple with the magnitude of the change that the past 2 years have brought. And indeed, there is something profoundly melancholic and morose in the way that Mishra concludes his book when he says that those of us who have opposed Israeli acts of savagery and the Western media's complicity in this crime of the century, it is clearly the crime of the century, and I'm quoting from Mishra's book, risk permanently embittering their lives with failure. I mean, at certain times during the day, I feel really embittered at what is going on in the world. Now, Mishra suggests that such expressions of outrage and solidarity may go some way in alleviating the profound loneliness of the Palestinians, that they hold out some hope for the world after Gaza. Now, to conclude this paper, I will go back to the melancholy of Afghani when he was imprisoned in Kabul in 1868, when he wondered what fate, to quote, the curtain of the unknown had hidden in store behind it. The lifting of this curtain of the unknown, or to use the uncharacteristically mystical term used by the very prosaic American political philosopher who taught at Harvard, John Rawls, the veil of ignorance. Okay, the veil of ignorance is a term that I'm kind of juxtaposing to the term curtain of unknown that Afghani used. It results in a certain kind of a mythical enlightenment captured by the term kashaf. Kashaf means a certain lifting of the veil, which results in a certain enlightenment. Now, we are behind that mystical veil. We do not know what the world will look like. I don't know, tomorrow, 5 hours from now, after this lecture has ended, we don't know what the world will look like. And it is this kind of unsettling that on the basis of which I have written this paper and gone back to Afghani. Now, when you are behind this particular veil of ignorance, this curtain of the unknown, as Afghani bewailed it, I'm reminded of those wonderful lines of Iqbal. Iqbal is not my favorite poet, by the way. I remember my grandfather quoting a lot of Iqbal, which is the reason why I remember so much of it, where he says that आलम नौ है अभी पर्दे तकदीर में, आलम नौ है अभी पर्दे तकदीर में, मेरी निगाहों में इसकी सहर है बेहिजाब. And I'm going to translate this. A new world is yet being sculpted by fate behind a veil of ignorance, or a curtain of the unknown, call it whatever you want to. Yet with mine eyes, I have gleaned the dawn of its beginnings. Final point that I want to make is that the vexed question of Palestine can only be evoked through the flight of a bird that has formed such an important component of this paper, its title. What better way to evoke this than to recall the words of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish when he lamented, "Where will the birds fly after the last sky?" It can be added that this is a sky fragmented and fractured by the sovereign claims of the nation state, crying out to be made whole once again. I'll stop there.
What a wonderful talk. What a wonderful. So let's hear the concluding remark, and then after that we have the
Yeah.
Rahil Saab.
Yeah, thank you, Razi Saab, and thank you, Supriya, for the introduction. To begin with, it's truly an honor to be speaking from this platform today, but let me confess at the same time, it's somewhat intimidating, given the fact that this platform has invited such luminaries to speak in the past, and sharing their company is, to be honest, both humbling and daunting. The paper we have heard today is my mind, an erudite and stimulating piece. It moves with elegance between the historical and conceptual, between Afghani's restless travels and the larger questions of Pan-Islamism, Islamic solidarity, nationalism, and political imagination. The paper is not only deeply researched, but beautifully written with evocative metaphors, as is characteristic of Professor Amir Ali's writings. And let me quickly add, before anyone suspects otherwise, I'm not saying this simply because the author happens to be my PhD supervisor. The praise is genuine and very well deserved. The paper is a rich meditation on Jamaluddin Afghani's life and thought, framed through the theme of peregrinations. Afghani appears here not only as a political activist, but as a restless traveler whose ceaseless movement itself becomes the ground of his political imagination. He is perpetually in motion, born in Iran, but presenting himself as Afghan, moving through India, Afghanistan, the Ottoman lands, Egypt, and finally Europe. Each sojourn is marked by the same rhythm: ingratiation with the rulers and elites, followed by suspicion and estrangement, and eventual expulsion. The paper captures this alternation beautifully, showing how Afghani's showing how Afghani's very inability to settle gave his political interventions both their energy and their fragility. And here I think Afghani belongs to a wider lineage of quote unquote anomalous intellectuals of modernity, like Marx wandering across Europe, slipping through the police, theorizing capital from the margins of belonging. Rosa Luxemburg, a Jewish Marxist in Poland, refusing to embrace the nationalism of her own land. Hannah Arendt, stateless, exiled, whose philosophy of totalitarianism was inseparable from her own displacement and statelessness. Afghani too was anomalous, never quite at home, never fully trusted. And it is precisely this anomalous position that makes it possible his imaginative leap towards Pan-Islamic solidarity. This paper also develops a fascinating duality in Afghani's persona. On one hand, Machiavellian operator, on the other, mystical visionary, likening himself to a falcon for whom the vastness of world is still too narrow. The author situates this bird imaginary in the Persian mystical tradition, and it's not hard to hear Afghani anticipating it. Earlier during the presentation, we heard few lines from Bali Jibril again, and the metaphor of bird comes here as well. The lines were "Tu Shaheen hai parwaaz hai kaam tera," but just as relevant is the preceding couplet in Bali Jibril. Agar kho gaya ek nashe man to kya gam, maqamate aaho
और भी हैं.
if one nest is lost, what sorrow? There are still many places for sighing and lamentation. Afghani's own life exemplifies this falcon-like refusal to grieve over a lost net. Each expulsion from India, Afghanistan, Istanbul, Cairo, and Tehran opened yet another horizon. His peregrinations were not a sign of failure, but the very condition of his originality. While the paper is deeply stimulating, I want to raise a few questions and possible lines of extension. These are not so much criticisms as invitations to think further about Afghani and the themes the paper has opened up. First, the paper makes a compelling case for Afghani's nested nationalisms, where local movements are subsumed under broader pan-Islamism. But I wonder whether this nesting was as stable as the paper suggests. In practice, Afghani often seems to work at cross purposes, encouraging national sentiment in Egypt and Iran while calling for transnational solidarity elsewhere. Should we read this as a coherent project or as a pragmatic and sometimes contradictory response to circumstances? Second, on Afghani's dual persona, the Machiavellian schemer and the mystical falcon. But there might be also a danger of romanticizing Afghani's mystical imagery. Was he really invested in mystical tradition? Or are we retrospectively casting his falcon metaphor into a mold because it resonates with Attar or Iqbal? In other words, how much of a mystical is Afghani himself, or how much is our reconstruction? Third, the paper underscores Afghani's practice of taqiyya, that is, concealing or dissimulating his Shia identity to forge unity. I wonder if it could be pushed further to illustrate upon the project of Pan-Islamism, whether the project itself rests on concealment and ambiguity. Is Pan-Islamism then less a doctrinal program and more a political performance of unity, performed in the larger political and global theater, one that could only ever work so long as fraught political identities were blurred? Finally, the paper, although we do not hear about this aspect in the presentation, but the paper makes a strong claim that Islamic and Muslim thought do not do nation states very well. There is an underlying incompatibility between the two. I suggest this is not a foregone conclusion. There were significant Muslim intellectuals, especially in India, who endeavored to reconcile Islam and nationalism. Maulana Azad's idea of Mutahida Qawmiyat or composite nationalism is perhaps the clearest example. Azad drew explicitly on Islamic precedents to argue that Hindus and Muslims could share equal political membership in plural nation. Recent scholarship on Azad, particularly Amar Soal's work on Muslim secularity, demonstrates that Muslim political thinking was not exhausted by Afghani's Pan-Islamism or Jinnah's Muslim nationalism. There was a parallel repertoire of thought that sought to justify national belonging through Islamic argumentation, not in opposition to it. Of course, the political trajectory of Azad's home country has not vindicated his vision of composite nation, but that in no manner diminishes the intellectual significance of Azad's project. If anything, it reminds us that the relationship between Islam and nationalism was not predetermined. It was contested, multiple, and open-ended. To bring Azad into conversation with Afghani would have complicated the neat incompatibility thesis and that the paper often alludes to and enrich the paper's conclusion. I'll stop here.
Quite challenging, wonderful conclusion. And now it challenges Amir Saab for your student has brought a new dimension. So before we go into that, we have our upcoming Saturday session. It is not very far off from what you're talking about in the early 20th century. Men at home. Uh, Imagining liberation in colonial and post-colonial India. And the speaker is a very well-known historian, Professor Gyanendra Pandey, who has appeared on this forum multiple times. He will be joined by another very well-known professor from Texas, Professor Kamran Asdar Ali, who has written a wonderful article recently in Dawn on who I just forgot, I forwarded a wonderful article on the progressive writers. And he is going to do the formal introductory remarks, concluding remarks by Professor Swapna M. Banerjee, a professor of history at Brooklyn College, New York. And so over to a illustrious Algerian Sayyid Rafat Hussain, for moderating the question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. So before we begin the question and answer sessions, please allow me to thank Dr. Amir Ali for a very interesting perspective, and Dr. Supriya Ranjan for the introductory remark, and Rahil Bashir for the concluding remarks. So the question and answer session is open now, and there are two options. You can raise your digital hand or put your comment or the question in chat box. So let's begin with the raised hand. Ambassador Ishrat Aziz Saab, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rafat. Am I visible and audible? Hello.
Yeah, you are audible, but let's see, we put you on the spot also.
Okay.
Yeah, you are.
I listened to the talk with great fascination on a fascinating subject, that is peregrinations of Jamaluddin Afghani, quite a traveler in those days. I have two questions. Very briefly, I'll state them. One is, as you know, he was an ardent believer in ijtihad. My question is, did he do any ijtihad on important issues like democracy, freedom of thought and conscience, equal rights for women, and for non-Muslim minorities in Muslim societies, apostasy, heresy, blasphemy, and economic issues like banking and finance for economic progress and strength, and give us his conclusions? That's one question. The second is, he was right in asserting that the West's power vis-a-vis Muslims is due to their progress in science and technology. My question is, did he apply his mind and say, why is it so? Is it because of lack of freedom of thought in Muslim societies? Did he not give his views on this very sensitive subject, because it would have been very controversial, and he already had faced many controversies? So that's my second question. And I will only say that nationalism is a practical reality, even if a conceptual incompatibility with Islamic universality. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I respond one by one, or should I take questions?
Yeah, please go ahead. And
Okay,
Go
thank you
one
so
by
much.
one.
So, before I come to Ambassador Ashad Aziz's questions, let me just quickly respond to the points that Rahil made, and they were very good points. I mean, you're right, Rahil. The second aspect, how mystical was he? Because one significant scholar, and I did refer to Ali Kadori at the beginning. I mean, Kedori's argument is that a lot of Afghani's reputation is posthumous. He wasn't as important as he was in his own lifetime. And this is actually a kind of a 20th century reconstruction. As far as his mysticism is concerned, the the aspect that I'm trying to bring up is that it can't wholly have been Machiavellian machination and political intrigue and interest in geopolitics. There's something much larger at play here that inspires the kind of passion. I mean, there's a tremendous energy that Afghani has, and that energy can only come from this kind of a slightly more mystical approach that I have interpreted in terms of the flight of the bird. Right, your last point about nationalism. Yes, I mean I agree with you that one looks at Azad or Hussein Ahmad Madni, the other very significant figure from the Indian subcontinent, where Mutahida Qawmiyat becomes an important part of it. But I would still go by the argument that it, it's not as if Afghani is against the nation, against nationalism, but there is a certain obstacle when it comes to the nation state. The thing about the nation state is that it's a very tightly drawn, compartmentalized political entity. And the overflowing nature of Islamic thought, especially when it comes to the global presence of the Ummah, will at some point always be obtruded by this particular presence of the nation state, which I call a kind of a watertight kind of a compartment. So there's almost as if there's a kind of a brimming over effect. And the nation state is something that does not allow this brimming over. And that is the reason why I kind of talk about the almost irreconcilable aspect of Muslim political thought and nation. Just to give you an example of this, a thinker that we often discuss, Rahil, Roger Brubaker. Now, Brubaker talks about the element of a nationalizing nationalism. You know, there's a kind of a super saturation of the nationalizing nationalism, the way that certain nation states are sought to be defined in a super saturated way by particular identities. I mean, I have my own country in mind right now in terms of what the majoritarian nationalism is doing. Now, it's precisely that element that I suggest is so completely at odds and at variance with a lot of Muslim thinking. So, Rahil, we will have an opportunity to keep disagreeing on this issue, but let me come to Ambassador Aziz's questions. On the question of Ijtihad, yes, you are absolutely right that he is one of those I stress the point creativity precisely because of this, because the duality between the taqlidi and the ijtihadi is the difference between a certain kind of a imitative copycat following something because it is authority. I'll just pick up 2 points on the question of women and free speech. Remarkably, he has very little to say on women. There is one point where he says that it is important for women to be educated because they will ultimately raise the next generation. Now, that's a pretty conventional thing to say. There's nothing very significant or insightful when he says that his own relationship with women is actually very, very controversial. He at the in Istanbul, he was offered by the Sultan one of the most beautiful women from the Sultan's harem in marriage. And he said, no, I'm not going to be bound down by marriage. So there's almost this element of misogyny, call it that if you want. Now, there's only one evidence of a romantic entanglement. This is with a German woman, Kathy. So quite often he would claim that he's beyond pressing sexual needs and stuff like that. But there's an ambivalence towards him, but he does make this significant gesture that somewhere that he wants to stay away from women, but he does make this point that yes, women need to be educated because they will be educating the next generation. But it's a very kind of a superficial thing that he's doing. On free speech, he has more to say because in his time in Istanbul, the 8 years, almost close to a decade, as I said, he oversees a veritable newspaper revolution. He is a journalist. Now, he is not known to be a great writer, but he is someone who does encourage the kind of free flow that journalism gives rise to. So on that issue, I'm sure he would have had to say much, much more. In fact, he does say much, much more. There are certain when Al-Ihram had been established before Afghani came to Cairo, but there are a series of other newspapers that he's associated with that he does write in, that he does encourage. So, for example, one of his students he starts his journal called Al-Nehla, which means bee. And then, of course, the Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa that I talked about in Paris. So he is associated with a series of publications where very, very significant political views are being put forward. On the question of technology, I mean, the term technicalistic that I'm using is from Marshall Hodgson. And the difference that I tried to make was that Afghani seems to be against the West, the elite Muslim response. Let's be as much like the Europeans as we can, and let us try to catch up with them. As I said, there is a particular idiosyncratic Islamic idiom that he's bringing in. Now, this idiosyncratic Islamic idiom is not Orthodox Islam, but it's a kind of a drawing from the solidarity of Pan-Islam that he's trying to bring up in this manner. I mean, for the 19th century, to think of it from that particular lens, technology is a very overwhelming thing to happen. I mean, now we are understanding the kind of a flip side to technology, the fact that technology and artificial intelligence itself could lead to the end of humanity itself. In those days, technology, I'm sure, would have been looked at in a much, much more positive manner. So there is a particular way in which technology is being looked at. The nation state and its practical reality, I agree with you, but I mean, that's my point. The very omnipresence of the nation state is what is creating this very difficult, intransigent difficulty for a lot of Muslim political thought right now. That is how I try to respond to Rahil's very good points and interventions. But I will kind of bring that point back to respond to the point about the
Thank you, Dr. Ali.
as a pragmatic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Let's move on. There are many questions. Dr. Sayyid Amir, please.
Thank you, Professor Amir Ali. I'm happy that we have a common first name. I don't know, you pronounce it as Amir or Amir?
Amir.
Well, that I
From
do.
Tamir.
Exactly the same.
Amir.
So there is a commonality. So I'm very impressed with your talk, especially the beautiful way you have correlated Maulana Fariduddin Jami Attar's conference on the birds and Machiavelli, the Italian politician, and the way you correlated, brought to bear his philosophy. I'm not sure if Maulana Jamaluddin Afghani would have appreciated that or would have even learned about it. Nevertheless, I think it is impressive. What comes to me is that, as you reported, excuse me, progenerations or travels of Maulana Jamaluddin Afghani, it never seemed to have any time left for making an impact on any one place, because he was so much traveling. And ultimately, I think the question arises, what was his legacy? In India, certainly he did not find very much support or traction. So Sayyid Ahmad Khan never supported him or was clearly very opposed to his ideas. And so this Pan-Islamism, except that it provides a topic for scholars like you and others, Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, for example, his follower, did it have any lasting impact? It doesn't seem to me is that many in the new generation, except, as I said, scholars like you, are not even aware of his work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, yeah, I think he was a bit of a rolling stone, if I can use that particular term. And we all know the English expression that rolling stones don't gather moss. And I think the fact that there's a lack of a lasting legacy perhaps has to do with this aspect. But as I said, many people will not know about Afghani. But remember that his student Muhammad Abdu, in turn Rashid Rida, and the journal that Rashid Rida started, the Manar, this is in many ways early 20th century Islamic intellectual thought is very significant. The reason why I bring back Afghani right now in the 21st century context is because, in June I was and for that matter, for the last so many months, I've been troubled by the presence of the Zionist nation state of Israel. Now, it is a nation state, right? And the point that Mahmoud Mamdani makes about nation states, it's a very valid point. He makes this point in his book, Neither Settler nor Native, is that the nation state is a potentially inherently genocidal entity. Now we are seeing that, as I speak right now, playing out. So I'm bringing back Afghani in terms of, when I talk about nested nationalism, to me that nested nationalism represents a certain kind of a suspicion towards a complete endorsement of the nation state. Now, the reason why the nation state becomes this dangerous entity is because it is prone to be genocidal if Mamdani's argument is to be accepted, because it is likely to weaponize its sovereignty against its weakest. Now, that is the danger, the political danger. I'm using a very, the American political scientist who wrote Weapons of the Week, James Scott. I'm kind of twisting that title around a bit. So that's the reason why I brought in Afghani right now. But to go back to the central nub of your question, perhaps the reason why there is no significant legacy is because the term that I'm using, he was a bit of a Rolling Stone. He kept moving around. And as we say, Rolling Stones kind of don't make much of an impact in terms of gathering moss. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Dr. Saeedzadi, please.
Actually, somebody already asked pretty much what I was planning to ask, so I will pass.
Thank you. Supriya, Ranjan, you wanted to say something?
So yeah, I have a question. So this question picks up from the last point that Rahil in some ways made, and we have had this constant common reading of Faisal Devzi and his writings. So I'll take it from there. So one of the things, one of the arguments that he makes while talking about Pan-Islamism is trying to bring out the anti-political character of Pan-Islamism. So he says that any call for unity, because politics, if we imagine politics as the arena of conflicts, whether we resolve conflicts or go on with conflicts, but essentially, if politics is about thinking about conflicts, resolving conflicts, thinking about diversity and other things, Pan-Islamism in some manner does not have that promise wherein these things, conflicts, internal conflicts, or will be resolved or in some ways thought about in a more serious manner. So it is in some sense a escape from the very political domain wherein we have to deal with all these things, wherein our identities will how do we relate to other identities in that sense of the term. So what will you say about this? There is a kind of anti-politics to Pan-Islamism wherein it imagines something, but it doesn't have resources, sort of to resolve that. That's my question. I hope I'm clear on this.
Yeah. Let me just respond to that saying I get the point about the lack of political agenda and therefore the supposedly anti-political element. Like this, if I can kind of make a rather sweeping statement, which is that a lot of Islamic thinking in the 20th century has been caught in a cleft between Pan-Islamism, which, as you said, seems to have no clear political agenda, and this obsession with the idea of an Islamic state, which has a very clear political agenda. Now, just think about that cleft, and it would give you a sense of a certain kind of a lack of direction. Now, my point about Pan-Islamism is, I don't really address the question that the point you're making. My point is that when I find the inability of a certain kind of a nationalist response to resolve itself in a nation state, okay, what it then becomes is kind of a sweeping, flowing over, brimming over aspect of Pan-Islamism. But yes, I kind of largely agree with the point you're making, that there is a kind of a lack of concrete political agenda. What it is in terms of a response to the technicalistic advance of European imperial powers like France and Russia, and Britain certainly, to an extent Russia as well, but Afghani doesn't hate the Russians as much as he hates the French, and he certainly hates the British the most. So I hope, Cyprian, that kind of vaguely responds to the point you're making.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Iltafat Hassan, please. Dr. Iltafat Hassan. Okay, we'll call him back.
No, I'm here. So I was trying to unmute myself, Rafa. Thank you. So, a kind of a follow-up question. I have always wondered about what is Pan-Islamism. And I actually Googled it today before I asked this question. And the Google definition is this desire to form an overall caliphate of all Muslim nations. I think that idea is dead. There's no way of going back to Pan-Islamism. We are all nation states now, and Pan-Islamism, in my opinion, has no value at this point. We have Christians in Haiti and Ethiopia, failed states, and we have Christianity in Europe, which is progressing like anything. So, what is the future of Pan-Islamism, and why don't the Muslims now concentrate on improving technology, which is the source for all the improvement in people's lives? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, again, it's to do with the diffuse nature of Pan-Islam, yes, but let me just kind of push back on the definition. The way that I'm looking at it is not so much the way that the Google definition offered. As I said in my talk, it resembles the pan movements of the 19th century in Europe. Pan-Slavism and Pan-Germanism was what I specifically mentioned. Now, the thing about these pan movements is that they are generally a complaint against the narrow, constricted nature of the nation state. And it's that sense that I'm trying to talk about Pan-Islamism. So just to kind of define the way that I talked about Pan-Islam, which is perhaps I should have done that in the paper itself when I was presenting, is that this seems to emanate from a particular complaint, a concern against the constrictions of the narrowness of constrictions and narrowness of nationalism. As far as political agenda, yes, well, I completely agree with you. I don't think any Islamist political agenda should be welcome. I refer to the work of the erstwhile Oxford scholar Tariq Rabdan, when he was writing in the context of Europe. He said, this distinction that Muslim societies have operated with for a long time, the Darul Harb and the Darul Islam, actually doesn't work anymore, because we have societies where constitutional guarantees give people, let's say, the right to freedom of expression, right to worship, the right to your conscience and your belief systems. So Ramdan, in a work that came out 15, 16 years ago, came up with the idea of a Darul Shahada, whereby Muslims are able to bear witness to the fact. For example, you live in England, or you live in France or Germany or America for that matter, Muslims are able to bear Shahada, the idea that this is a society which is not persecuting people on the basis of religious faith. Now, I say that with a certain kind of a bit of a shiver, because we see persecution across the world happening. But Ramdan wrote this work some 15 years ago, when the kind of trends, Islamophobic trends that we are witnessing right now, had not really surfaced as much. So I hope that definition of Islamophobia explains the way that I've been using the term Pan-Islamism. Sorry, not Islamophobia, but definition of Pan-Islamism.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. So, Dr. Abdul Jabbar, you are on the spot.
I think Dr. Nazir Ahmed is first, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Let him speak.
You go ahead, or you want him to go first?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Nazir Ahmed, please.
Thank you, sir. Whether he was a patriot or turncoat, the verdict is still out. I look upon the disruptive politics of Jamaluddin Afghani as a manifestation of a tension between a lost spiritual tradition and an unattained wannabe modernity in the context of the tentacles of spreading colonialism. Whether we look upon what he did achieve, his one positive achievement was his influence on the tobacco revolution of Iran, as you rightly pointed out, and the Iranian Revolution of 1906. But his disruptive politics, whether it be in the Mahdi uprising in the Sudan, or the Urabi resistance in Egypt, or the politics that emerged after Sultan Abdul Hamid II, etc., has to be looked at in his Salafi views, which also show up in the writings of Muhammad Abduh. My only question to you, sir, is this: did Jamaluddin Afghani write much about the economic foundations of colonialism, and what solutions, if any, did he offer to Muslims about that?
Well, thank you for that question, because it actually goes back to an earlier question which I didn't respond to about the economic aspects. And yes, there are mentions of that. For example, before the Urabi Rebellion, 1879 to 1882, there are a series of loans that the British and the French are giving out, and those loans are the manner in which these societies are being ensnared, in terms of the fiscal rules that are being enforced. So he does have, it's not systematically worked out, but he does have a good sense of the manner in which Muslim societies are being ensnared by the colonial powers, and how these colonial powers are spreading their tentacles through these financial mechanisms. Now, this is true of Egypt. It is true of Iran, certainly, and you did mention the 1891 tobacco rebellion. Um, I mean, the immediate reason for that rebellion, of course, was the tobacco concession that was given to the British. But there were a series of other concerns. I mean, the certain rivers, for example, and public works that were being given. So it was widely perceived as a sellout. So it, to my mind, I may be wrong about this. There's not a systematic understanding of the economic aspects of colonialism, but there are very clear fragments um, that could be built upon. For example, the point that I made about India and his observation about railways, that this is not going to do any good to Indians themselves, but that this was open up the hinterland, is a clear example of what later Dadabhai Naoroji would call the drain of wealth from India. So he does have that sense of the financial underpinnings of the financial tentacles that are able to suck and extract resources from colonies. But I don't think it would be very systematically worked out, given the tentative nature of his journalism. His journalism, I'm saying it's tentative because he's not a very great writer. He's more of a, he's more of a oral tradition person, someone who wants to expound. He believes in the viva voce. His students love him precisely for that reason. It's not as if he doesn't write, but he's not the greatest writer that is around. So I hope that responds to your question immediately. Also, let me say that I would completely agree with your observation that there is a kind of a, he's caught in this kind of a binary between an old spiritual tradition that is lost and a wannabe modernity, and somehow he kind of seems to try to fill that gap and doesn't seem to do so very successfully. And I think that is an observation that I would completely agree with.
Thank you.
So can I?
Yeah, now you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So fantastic discussion because for someone who have not really knew about Afghani, a revealing portrait of his life. So I think it's you talked about it. I think it's he was self-contradicted himself, looks to me, right from the beginning. So he did want to be identified Iranian Shia, but he took Afghani kind of name. I don't know what was the reason for that. If you are self kind of contradicting yourself, he's a philosopher, of course. It looks like he thought about issues of the day, but also he is a little bit of arrogant. Looks to me in terms of his, you talked about he was thinking philosophers can see beyond as opposed to prophets. So that is just kind of speaks to his arrogance, intellectual arrogance, whatever the arrogance. That is not a good recipe for for somebody so clearly he failed in terms of prophets work with people at the ground level. Philosophers write and then they just expose the ideas, but clearly he became kind of trapped in that cocoon. That's what I see reading in the AA overview. So I think you did touch on in the end about his failure, probably because of his elitist connection. So clearly, he is somebody, he read Islamic principles. He was deep thinker, but at the same time, he was not able to make connections to ordinary people. So can you kind of expand a little bit on the theme? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, towards the end, I did make this point that there's a certain kind of, for want of better word, defeatism that enters into, because a lot of his political energy has been expended in terms of cultivating rulers and elites. He feels that if I can hit at that particular point, that would perhaps be a transformation. Now, quite remarkably, he's able to make a convincing case. But I did quote, and the quote comes from the Nikki Keddie book. This is the most authoritative political biography of Afghani that was published back in 1972. There is a point made that towards the end he says, but perhaps I should have expended my energy a little more on the people. Now, what we have in Afghani, I think, in addition to all the points that you made about his contradictions, is a remarkably energetic man. And the sources of that energy is something that I've often tried to understand where exactly is this coming from. I mean, he's not someone who is subject to what we in Urdu call pasti, defeatism. He doesn't have that. But I think, to respond to your question centrally, that he's up against something that a lot of philosophers, someone as orthodox as Ibn Ghazali would have felt, which is the difference in the esoteric and the exoteric. The meaning of something which is clear to everyone and the meaning of something which should not be clear to everyone, but only a certain kind of a narrow, initiated elite. And I think somewhere he's not able to resolve this particular problem or this issue of the esoteric and the exoteric, which is why we have this kind of a aporia, if I can use that particular term, which we use in philosophy, where there is a kind of a conclusion that is not a conclusion. So what we have is, like most lives, it's conclusively inconclusive, which is what I think life is all about, being conclusively inconclusive.
Thank you so much. There is a question from Shrikant. Do you think that concept of Pan-Islamism was and remains an aspirational one, because to achieve the complete unity necessitates a cohesive political control and regime on the diverse domains? And I can add my question in the same one, that is it possible, the Pan-Islamism? I had a similar question.
As a concrete political program, I think someone did point this out earlier, that it's not conceivable for it to have any kind of achievable political aim. So that aspect of it is up. As a broader sentiment that will pervade the world, I don't think it's ever going to go away. As long as there are Muslims around, and there's no reason why they should not be around, and as long as they spread in diasporas and live in other parts of the world, that it's likely to be around. Now, what are the political uses for this going to be? I really don't know. All I can say is, for example, I'm someone who has been very, very forthrightly and frequently speaking out on the issues of Palestine, as I'm sure many people will be speaking out. Now, I was asked by a student some few months ago, what difference does it make to you? I mean, your frequent writing about this, the lectures that I've given, I mean, it is actually in many ways inhibiting many people's careers. It's perhaps inhibiting my career as well. And the point that I made is that, I'm not a great practicing Muslim. There are aspects of it that I do imbibe, but I must say that I have been inspired by the idea of what in English would be called commending the right and condemning the wrong, which means that every time you see an injustice, there are three levels of belief that one has. If you can stop it, go and stop the injustice that is happening. Now, many of us can't do that. Michael Cook has written a whole book on this called Commanding the Right and Forbidding the Wrong. It's called Amr bil Maruf or Nahi al Munkar. The second level is that you speak out against it. I mean, free speech becomes a very important aspect of this. Now, there are times when you can't even do that. I mean, there are times, for example, on American university campuses right now, you cannot take a clear position on question of Palestine. And if you can't even do that, at least you can just have to condemn it in your heart. So my point is that as a larger, not a political program, but as a kind of a larger ethical concern that pervades Muslim societies across the world, it, I think, can conceptualize the idea that I put forward as commending the right and condemning the wrong, which I think is one of the beginnings to address injustice. I'm a great reader of the 18th century, the British political theorist Edmund Burke, and someone he's supposed to have said that, well, the reason why evil prevails in the world is not because of a lack of good men and women. It is because good men and women just refuse to speak out. So, as an ethical tradition, this kind of a presence of Pan-Islamism can exhort people, especially Muslims, to stand up for the right, as I said, commend the right and condemn the wrong. I think that would be a worthwhile presence in the world, which is so evil right now.
Thank you. So I don't see any more. Let me see. Don't you think? Another question from Zahid Bukhari. Don't you think that the Palestine issue has expanded the idea of Pan-Islamism?
In the way that I just talked about it right now, the way that I talked about commending the right and condemning the wrong, I think that this is going to be the hinge on the basis of which the 21st century will change, the Palestinian issue. I refer to Pankaj Mishra's book, The World After Gaza. And my point is that what we are witnessing, I mean, this kind of wholesale slaughter, which is clearly a genocide, a kind of a deliberately engineered famine. What we are witnessing is the most egregious instance of what nation states are capable of doing, the state of Israel in this case. And I mean, I often make this point to my students, and I often say that, you know, when the 19th century became the 20th century, there were certain carryovers of the 19th century that had to be resolved for the 20th century to move forward. The reason why the 21st century knows no peace right now, I mean, you have wars, for example, the Ukraine crisis, the what the Russians call the special military operation in Ukraine, and this crisis that seems to have no end, is because we have not been able to resolve the issues of the 20th century. And until the issues of the 20th century are not resolved, I don't think the world will see peace, and we will see these unending wars. I mean, war is big business. And the most complex carryover of the 20th century that I can think of is this thing that we call free market capitalism. I'm not a great admirer of the idea of free market capitalism. I know that it's a bit of a cliche in the US, but we are seeing the kind of vast levels of inequality that it has given rise to. So my point would be that as far as Gaza is concerned, I don't know if it has given rise to a certain renewed relevance for Pan-Islamism. But what I would say is that it is reflective of a particular carryover that is almost anarchic in terms of Israel as a settler colonial society. And this is something that is, of course, impinging upon Muslims. And it is something that certainly needs to be condemned. And this is, as I would recommend, the idea of commending what is wrong, commending what is right, and
yeah,
condemning
Dr.
what is
Ali,
wrong.
let me expand upon that. Is Gaza issue really a Islamic issue? I know there are both point of view. Some will say yes, some will say no. But I wanted to know your point of view. Is it Islamic issue?
No, I would not say that it's an Islamic issue. In fact, when people like Afghani were right, Afghani had no clue about it, of course. But even, for example, his disciples like Rashid Rida, for example, there are clear instances in which he is aware of this increasing infiltration, the Jewish National Fund buying up lands in historical Palestine. But a lot of people who are writing in the 20s and 30s are not framing it as an Islamic issue. And I don't think it is right to frame it as an Islamic issue. This is clearly an issue of how dehumanizing a nation state can be.
Thank you.
How much it can dehumanize people.
Yeah, I do agree.
It is a human issue.
Yeah, it's a human right issue. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that concludes. I don't see any raised hand. Please let me know if I missed anyone. I don't think I did, but I was closely monitoring both the raised hand and, of course, the chat box. So thank you once again, all three speakers. It was a wonderful session. And before the session is concluded, I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin for final remark and, of course, a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafat, for that wonderful session and remarkable, very enlightening and very challenging talk. And I have a question, and maybe a little comment. There are two parts. One is when Afghani comes to mind, there is only one personality in modern Indian political history, which is very much like him in that kind of political journey, is Maulana Hazrat Mohani. Maulana Hazrat Mohani was known for not sitting at one place. Sitting at one place means not sticking to one political ideology. He went to Congress, of course, he was very much identified with it. He went even to Muslim League. He sat with the communists, so he was everywhere. And sometimes he annoyed the political thinkers of his time. And sometimes, he was actually, at one point, Nehru had to say that, Maulana, just firmly sit at one place. I mean, there were, and he was even with Ambedkar for a long time. And Gandhi ji was a little nervous about it. So what I'm saying is just like him in the modern time, Hazrat Mohani was doing subconsciously certain thing, but he never claimed as a philosopher and never claimed. Now come to this thing about Pan-Islamism as related to Gaza. I will rather say that the failure of Muslim Ummah at every level, at everywhere, even in the very advanced majority states like Turkey or even Pakistan, for not responding to anything. It is remarkable to see today in Security Council, Pakistani ambassador has really talked very strongly, which was unusual. But regardless of that, and the Muslim populations on the, totally indifferent Muslim populations. I mean, you can see what happened in Nepal. You can easily do the similar thing in any Arab state or streets, but you don't see it. Totally sullen and totally indifferent. So it is never not going to be a pan-Islamic thing, rather I think a change of heart to get rid of the old romantic concept of all Muslim ummah together, rather radicalizing a new generation to stand up and change the discourse of their, existing corrupt regimes and become something different and make some kind of readjustment with the modern world to make deals or to develop further or whatever. But this pan-Islamism, even in the existing form, Latin form, is a dead issue and it's not going to solve anything. Pankaj Mishra is not a Muslim. Pankaj Mishra wrote with the same passion. Or the streets in Calcutta or Bombay or in the West are very different than their governments. They rose, or even Jewish young youths in New York.
Yes. Yeah.
No, they want to change this discourse. So it is a issue, a human issue. It's nothing to do with Muslim or Islam. And by the way, Muslims failure on every level of imagination itself is challenging Muslim whether keeping Islam at home is all right, whether it's better to do that, become very good Muslim, but change the discourse of politics and the rest of the thinking. Sir, I don't want you to say something, but this is what I'm thinking.
I should just add the point that I'm very impressed by the way that the first protests were actually by Jews in New York.
Yeah.
Jews against genocide. I mean, that is admirable in terms of the way that people have been standing up and saying, not in our name. So, and to underline the point that you have made and also previously made, it is ultimately a human issue and the dehumanization that certain nation states are capable of doing. And hence my point about the nation state that ultimately, when it weaponizes, misuses its sovereignty, it is entirely capable of dehumanizing certain sections. And that is perhaps the point where this discussion needs to rest. Ultimately, bringing back the human component, irrespective of what that may be.
Yeah. You look at in London yesterday, 700 arrests were made. Most of those arrests are who are arrested are mostly non-Muslims, white.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
they traveled from different cities just to be
Yeah.
pro-Palestinian in the demonstration and resist. I mean, that is the registration of their contempt of the government. And even Zohran Mamdani, he wins
Yeah.
overwhelmingly Brooklyn, which is
Mhm.
a majority Jewish population.
Mhm.
So, and he still remains the very strong candidate there. So, this really Muslim, even at least the youth, have to rethink. They should really recalibrate.
I think if I could say, also we should note that in this country, I'm talking about the United States, the biggest supporters of Israel and its policies in Gaza are not Jews. It is the evangelical Christians.
Christians, yeah.
And who draw their support on the basis of some passage in Bible. And they think their God is in a real estate business, has given that part of the world to Jews.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you.
true. Amir bhai bahut sahi kaha. Okay, all right. With this, let's conclude and say bye-bye to each other and rejoin on coming Saturday on Ganendra Pandey's.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
rest.
you.